Hi, everyone. Welcome to our special briefing on artificial intelligence, and thank you for joining. My name is David Naylor. I'm a tech transactions and digital economy lawyer and co-head our EMEA data privacy, cybersecurity, and digital assets practice. I'd now like to hand over to each of our panelists and invite them to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pablo Carrillo of counsel at Swire Patton Boggs, also the strategic lead on congressional oversight and investigations. Before arriving at the firm, I served as the chief of staff to the late U.S. Senator John McCain, and previously, before that, as his general counsel at the Senate Armed Services Committee. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Genevieve Hubbard. I'm an associate at the firm in the Washington, D.C. office.
My name is Matthew Kirk. I'm International Affairs Advisor based in the London office with David. I have a past partly in technology business and partly in diplomacy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Economidis. I am a public policy advisor based in the Square Patent Box Brussels office, and I'm working on European public policy.
Everyone, it's Shamian Al here. I'm based in our Singapore office. I'm a tech and data partner, and I'll be covering Asia in today's webinar.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to have panelists with us from so many different jurisdictions and different time zones. I'm sorry for those where it's very early or very late, but it's great to have you on the panel. Let's start with some context. In the last 3,000 years, if we look at key measures of what you might call human success, such as GDP per capita and life expectancy, not much happened of significance from a macro perspective until the Industrial Revolution around 260 years ago. Since then, the global population has grown at least sixfold. There's been a huge shift from a largely agrarian-based economy to one focusing on manufacturing and increasingly services, and significant job creation and disruption. Many commentators agree that we're now at the start of the fourth industrial revolution, with potentially even more rapid and significant change ahead, and many believe that AI will fuel that change. Next slide, please. This slide very effectively demonstrates how quickly AI technologies are now gaining significant traction. It shows the pace at which leading technology applications reached 1 million users. It took, as you can see from the graph, Apple about 74 days to get to this point, adding, on average, around 13,500 users per day. ChatGPT did it in 5 days. It's this pace of change that has focused the minds of policymakers and governments on AI regulation. There is now significant legislative activity focusing on the regulation of AI in most major jurisdictions. With this in mind, I'm going to hand over to Genevieve and Pablo to update us on what's happening in this area in the United States.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Hello, everyone. We're going to start off with an overview and analysis of U.S. AI law and policy during the 118th Congress, effectively 2023. Next slide, please. David's observations with regard to ChatGPT absolutely had implications in the U.S., particularly among law and policymakers, perhaps more so than any other single factor. The deployment of that generative AI capability commercially in November of 2022 did, in our view, more to catalyze interest in Congress and in the White House on the need to regulate the development and use of AI. That having been said, policy and lawmakers are trying to strike a balance between mitigating observed risks associated with the development and use of AI without stifling desired innovation. Notable about how the White House and Congress have been going about doing so is the open door that they have provided to industry stakeholders in educating policy and lawmakers on the technology, not only on the technology itself, but also the policy implications of AI's development and use to a degree that we really rarely see, particularly with regard to technology policy. That having been said, our best intelligence today is that in the US, comprehensive AI legislation will probably not be filed in Congress in the short term, leaving the administration to take more of a prominent role. We believe that we may expect something from Leader Schumer in January of next year, but the likelihood of enactment, and we'll talk more about this later, remains unclear. In terms of the administration taking a more prominent role in the absence of congressional activity, we've already seen this by the executive order that President Biden recently issued on AI. And in that regard, my colleague Genevieve will talk more about that right now. Genevieve?
Thanks, Pablo. Yes, I will speak briefly about the White House's role in AI policy in the U.S. As Pablo mentioned, the Biden administration has looked to take a leading role in AI policy and regulation, at least to the extent that they can without congressional action. And they have framed that leading role in the context of the United States' strategic competition with China. The administration has curbed Chinese access to AI chips and seeks to maintain the U.S.'s lead over China in the development of AI technology. The White House views safety and innovation as related issues, understanding that the U.S. cannot harness AI's transformative potential without first implementing some guardrails that encourage adoption while also mitigating risk. And that has been their principal aim, most recently and most consequentially with President Biden's executive order on AI. Not only is it the most significant action the U.S. government has taken on AI so far, but we just learned, as Pablo mentioned a few days ago, that Leader Schumer's anticipated comprehensive AI bill is expected to come out likely in January of next year and will largely pivot off of the EO. And that is precisely what the president intended for it, to lay out a framework for a discussion among policymakers and Congress for regulating the development and use of AI with data privacy and security considerations as well. And we are already seeing that come to pass. For example, the EO mandates that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, establish standards for AI safety testing and develop a companion resource to its risk management framework for generative AI. 2 weeks ago, Senators Thune and Klobuchar released draft legislation to require NIST to do just that and more. So we are already seeing portions of the EO surface as draft legislation in Congress. The EO truly is a framework organized by 8 guiding principles ranging from safety and security to equity and civil rights to innovation and competition to advancing American global leadership on AI. President Biden signed the order on October 30th of this year, and it does principally deal with the use of AI by federal agencies because that is something that the president can dictate by executive order without Congress. However, of course, the White House hopes that the federal government's influence in the marketplace through both their buying power and their enforcement tools will influence private sector behavior. And there are a few noteworthy provisions that do impact the private sector in the executive order, and I want to mention a few of those now. The first are a few oversight provisions on the AI industry. The executive order invokes the Defense Production Act to monitor companies developing dual-use foundation models that could pose risks to national security. These companies must regularly report on how they train and test these models and their efforts to protect their technology from espionage. Cloud service providers are also required to report to the Commerce Department when foreign customers pay for their services related to training large AI models, especially those with potential malicious cyber capabilities. There are also numerous provisions included for the U.S. generally to better attract talent from foreign nationals working in AI and critical and emerging tech. The executive order directs the Patent and Trademark Office to provide guidance for AI-related patents. It directs the Federal Trade Commission to enforce fair competition in the AI sector. The Commerce Department must ensure that smaller companies are included in things like semiconductor programs, and it recommends watermarking for content developed by AI. And finally, 2 more items I want to note. First, the EO underscores the need for the enactment of comprehensive data privacy legislation in the U.S., as Pablo will mention, something that has bipartisan interest in Congress but has not yet come to pass. And there's a global element to the EO, as it notes that the Biden administration has collaborated and plans to continue to collaborate with international partners and to align its AI policy with the United Nations. That's a very quick overview, but for those interested, we're happy to provide more details on the contents of EO and what the future of its various mandates may look like. It does also face implementation challenges, of course. It calls for substantial and perhaps unprecedented interagency coordination and resources. And many of these goals will need legislative backing to be fully realized. And that's where we think the EO is of most relevance and greatest importance as a template for the anticipated congressional legislation likely to come early next year. And with that, I will pass it back to Pablo to talk about what is happening in that legislative space on Capitol Hill.
Thank you, Genevieve. Next slide, please. So as we're wont to say in the U.S., this is a little inside baseball on this slide. Basically, the spectrum of views in Congress on how comprehensive AI legislation should look are represented by the members of Congress reflected here. So on one side of the continuum, reflecting an aggressive, bipartisan, comprehensive, near-term approach is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. We'll talk about more what he has in mind in just a moment. On the other hand, a vastly more deliberative, even hands-off approach is represented by former Republican presidential candidate and currently the top Republican in the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Ted Cruz. Next slide, please. That having been said, with a framework for legislating on AI in the U.S. already having been laid by President Biden's executive order, as Genevieve described, we expect comprehensive legislation to address these policy equities. They're self-evident in this slide. The real takeaway here is that while all of them have some degree of bipartisan appeal, in many cases, there are significant differences in opinion on how to address them. For example, the last bullet on openness is a good example. So yes, there is a significant bipartisan interest in encouraging research and publicizing industry best practices and ensuring the availability of quality data to researchers and developers. However, there's a significant debate on the appropriateness or desirability of having a new independent regulatory authority establish a licensing regime, for example, governing large language models and frontier AI capability. It's a good example of a good amount of bipartisanship at the strategic policy level, but as folks often say, the devil's in the details. Next slide, please. These distinctions come into sharper relief by looking at various pieces of legislation that have been introduced or that have otherwise been discussed by prominent members of Congress. First here, the Senate. The Safe Innovation Act for AI, which is a legislative concept, no bill has been filed yet, by Senate Majority Leader Schumer and Todd Young from Indiana, who is a top advocate of the CHIPS Act and the CHIPS for Science Act here in the U.S., provides for an overarching architecture that's already obtained broad support, upon which subsequent AI legislation should be based. Once again, our intelligence is that Leader Schumer will in fact file a comprehensive AI bill as early as January of next year. As Genevieve described, we expect that it will harvest from President Biden's executive order on AI that he recently issued, particularly aspects of it for which there is major bipartisan interest, jettisoning the rest. The Blumenthal-Hawley AI framework that we also have listed here lays a hard marker on a controversial approach to regulating AI in the U.S. I referred to it just a moment ago. Once again, it would establish an independent AI oversight body to administer, among other things, a licensing regime, particularly with regard to so-called high-risk AI models. With regard to licensing the most advanced AI models, it's notable, particularly frontier models. Notably, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has already conveyed support to Congress, his support for the idea in Congress. Another bill not listed here, filed by Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Elizabeth Warren, also established an independent regulatory commission with licensing authority over major technology platforms involved in AI development. Neither of these bills are expected to be adopted anytime soon, but the big takeaway here is, once again, they are representative of some strongly held views on what basic approach should be taken by the U.S. with regard to regulating AI development and use. Especially notable, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of this slide, especially notable about the Senate's approach to AI policy is once again the open door that is provided to relevant stakeholders as it considers these issues, particularly Mr. Altman and Elon Musk, probably most prominently. There have been a number of insight forums that have already occurred and a few more yet to go, but that's going to play a prominent role in how the Senate chooses to go about addressing AI policy going forward. The final bullet takeaway on this slide is reflects an area where there is apparently widespread bipartisan support, that is with regard to AI policy, and that's in the area of prohibiting the use of misleading AI generated material in an electoral context, especially in the run-up to 2024 and the 2024 elections. However, due to competing legislative priorities, it is unclear whether or not this particular bill by Senator Klobuchar and Senator Hawley can be enacted before the end of this legislative year. Next slide, please. At this point, legislative interest in regulating AI in the U.S. House of Representatives seems a bit more dispersed, a bit more diffuse than what we're seeing in the Senate. However, examples of various bills that have already been dropped that are on point, we have listed here. A top takeaway regarding the House's approach includes the leading role that Congressman Jay Abernathy may have in guiding Republican consideration in this effort. Notably, Representative Abernathy is the only computer engineer and AI technical expert in the U.S. Congress. A final note about data privacy. This is important. Genevieve referred to it a moment ago. Not only does President Biden view a comprehensive data privacy legislation as foundational to AI regulation, but so does the primary co-sponsor of what will probably be the most viable bill on this issue going forward, Congresswoman Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers. And so we do at this point expect movement on her marquee American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which would establish a federal framework for a comprehensive framework for data privacy in the United States. Next slide, please. So as we see Congress continuing to wrestle on how it will address regulating AI development and use, particularly comprehensively, these are the issues to look out for. Once again, against this backdrop, we don't expect comprehensive legislation, but certainly before the end of the year. However, we do expect Leader Schumer to drop his own comprehensive bill as early as January. Query, however, whether it will be enacted, particularly in a presidential election cycle. But if it does move, it'll likely be the primary vehicle by which the U.S. Congress asserts itself on how to regulate AI development and use going forward. With that, I'll throw it back to Genevieve. Next slide, please.
Christina, I think you're up next.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So we would like to just start with give you a brief overview of the European Union's AI policies. So first of all, we wanted to just give you a brief overview on the setting the scene essentially to what the EU has been doing in terms of the policies. So the EU has generally been envisaging to become a global leader in artificial intelligence policies. So starting in 2018 with the AI high-level expert group that presented ethic guidelines for the trustworthy artificial intelligence that should be based on three key pillars, being lawful, ethical, and robust. Then following with a multi-stakeholder forum that drive forward AI policy recommendations, so the European AI Alliance, and then the presentation of EU AI laws. So in 2021 and 22, we had two pieces of legislation that were published, the AI Act and also the AI Liability Directive. And then, of course, the EU has been trying to leverage its position in the international scene through various fora. So starting with the AI Pact. So this is just a voluntary forum that will be including EU and non-EU actors that will essentially work towards the implementation of the AI Act. Then equally, AI codes of conduct that initially started with the Trade and Technology Council, the EU and US Trade and Technology Council, that eventually fed into the Hiroshima project, the Hiroshima AI process that essentially is creating voluntary commitments that AI high-level AI systems can be using, and then equally the OECD, the latest development at the OECD level, where we have the definition of artificial intelligence that is proposed to be very close to the definition, to be close to the AI Act. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So indeed, this piece of legislation is currently far advanced in the negotiating process. At the moment, it introduces a novel approach in terms of the risk-based approach to AI that distinguishes between unacceptable high, low, and minimal risks posed to fundamental rights and safety of AI users. It does have an extraterritorial application, so that applies to all AI systems, whether based in the EU or not. And it introduces mandatory risk management processes and requirements for AI systems providers, and it also has very strong governance and enforcements of the AI Act, with a new European AI board that will be created, and also very hefty fines for non-compliance with the rules. If we can move to the next slide, please. So we are currently, as I said, to a very far advanced process, with the ambition to conclude the negotiations by the end of 2023. So at the moment, we are within what is so-called the interinstitutional negotiations, so also known as trilogue negotiations. The coming 2 weeks are actually going to be very critical, because there is another meeting held next week, and it is expected to be the final negotiation. But as it is highlighted in this slide, there are already a number of issues that negotiations have been concluded. For example, the classification rules for high-risk AI systems, or regulatory sandboxes, which is a very important element for AI systems, but also the penalties, which equally is quite high. We're looking up to 40 million euro, or up to 7% of total worldwide annual turnover. So that's quite a high percentage when it comes to non-compliance, but also a number of outstanding issues that are going to be discussed during next week's meetings, which negotiators expect to be the final one, namely on foundational models in generative AI, some of the prohibitions on AI practices, but also some technical aspects relating AI definitions, the fundamental rights impact assessment, and determining some of the high-risk AI systems. At the moment, the entry into effect is something that is still being negotiated, but in any case, this is a live debate, and at the moment, we don't exactly know how this will be, when we will have the final agreement, because the negotiations are still ongoing, but now we're really at the crunch time. I would just like to highlight one of the main elements of negotiations, the foundational models, which have been a contentious aspect of the negotiation so far, and at the moment this is likely to dominate the discussion going forward. If we can move to the next slide, please. For the sake of completeness, we also wanted to touch base on the AI Liability Directive. This is the second piece of legislation, which is at the moment idle because of its connection to the AI Act. It essentially introduces a uniform fault-based liability regime for damages and victim compensation in case of damages caused by AI systems. There is a close link to the AI Act because of the evidence that is needed to determine the plausibility of claims for damages, but that would need to be recorded under the AI Act. And because of the link with the uncertainty under the AI Act, given the ongoing negotiations, co-legislators have decided to pause the negotiations at the moment until there is clarity on the AI Act. I think one aspect I wanted to mention is about the fact that even though this is a liability piece of legislation, and it determines the respective liability regime for AI systems. There is still a liability embedded within the AI Act with a very high penalties that as I have indicated previously. And finally, I'll conclude with the fact that the negotiations on the AI Act would need to be concluded by April 2024 at the latest, because afterwards the European Parliament is dissolved. And if not, then that will mean that we can have a much longer delay in terms of the application and the enforcement of the AI Act and also the AI Liability Act. And with that, that concludes my presentation. So thank you for your attention, and I will now pass on to hand over to Matthew.
Thank you very much, Christina. Well, in the UK, the approach is a rather different one, although the identification of the risks and ethical challenges that the UK government has undertaken looks very similar to that in the EU. The UK has, however, decided to adopt what it has described as a pro-innovative approach to regulation of AI, and essentially start from the principle that a great deal of activity that is undertaken by AI systems will already be regulated by various pieces of sectoral or thematic regulation, health and safety regulation, privacy regulation, communications regulation, and so forth. And therefore, the UK government's thesis is that the AI systems should be allowed to develop within the economy, be monitored as part of that, and existing regulatory tools should be able to tackle most of the challenges. If challenges come up which existing tools cannot tackle, then new regulatory tools can be created at that point. So the overall framework that the British government has put forward in a white paper published in March this year has 5 underpinning principles: safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. And those principles will inform how regulators set about regulating the way in which AI manifests itself in different sectors of the economy. One of the points the British government has made is that you need to look at the impacts in society and in the economy, not at the technologies themselves. A chatbot which is servicing a call center for consumer services has a very different risk profile to a chatbot that is prescribing medicine or making critical medical decisions. Could I have the next slide, please? So as part of this, guidance is being issued to regulators as to how they are to regulate AI within their sectors, to try to get as much consistency in the regulatory approach as possible. You will see there in the guidance, the key points of the guidance, an awful lot of use of words like proportionate and appropriate, which does leave quite a lot of discretion open to regulators to regulate in different ways. For the moment, the government is proposing to leave this guidance on a non-statutory basis, but has kept the option of creating a statute that would place this guidance on a statutory basis if necessary in future. And then a central function is being created to monitor and evaluate how AI is operating in the economy as a whole, to take feedback, to support regulators in a coherent implementation of the principles, to support innovators, including, as in the EU, the idea of regulatory sandboxes and horizon scanning, and critically, interoperability with other international regulatory frameworks. This is seen as a key element for the UK. Could I have the next slide, please? This is an attempt to pull this regulatory framework together on a single slide. You can see central government at the top, establishing the policy parameters, deciding on the high-level view of risk, and updating regulations as necessary. And then this new central risk function, monitoring function, sitting below that, with a much more hands-on day-to-day approach to how AI is manifesting itself in the economy and society. Then the sectoral and thematic regulators who will be picking up in their respective areas of competence how AI is being used. And finally, businesses, consumers, and so forth who will be experiencing AI and bringing it into their operations as they go forward. And then finally, on the next slide, I just wanted to say a quick word about the Bletchley AI Safety Summit, which happened at the beginning of this month, attended by 29 countries, critically including the three most important jurisdictions, the US and China, where the bulk of AI innovation is happening, and the EU, where, as Christina has just described, the world's first comprehensive piece of AI legislation is being put in place. The Bletchley Summit produced a declaration of principles, which included ideas such as that AI should be human-centric, trustworthy, and responsible in order to be safe, to enhance international cooperation and collaboration. They looked particularly at the safety risks of frontier AI, general purpose AI models, including foundation models, and particularly in areas such as cybersecurity, biotechnology, and disinformation. And then they supported an internationally inclusive network of scientific research on frontier AI. The Bletchley Summit was originally intended to be a one-off, but the enthusiasm that was engendered by it has now transformed it into a process, with further summits happening in the course of the next year in South Korea and in France. And I would say alongside that, there has been a great deal of work done in international fora as well, which the UK sought to try to draw together in the Bletchley Summit. And with that, I will pass on to Charmian and to Asia.
Thanks very much, Matthew. We will now move to the last regional block that we'll be covering in this webinar, and that is Asia. And here we have summarized in the next two slides for you the key existing and pending legislation specifically on AI. There has been a flurry of activity across the board in Asia. I think it's fair to say, though, that it's apparent that not all nations have immediate intentions to regulate or to enact standalone comprehensive AI laws. That is not to say that there aren't existing laws that would apply to AI development and AI deployment, but in terms of comprehensive standalone legislation, it is a varied scene. We wanted very much to focus on China in this webinar, and that is because of two main factors. Number one, China is regarded as a superpower in AI, and number two, because of the tremendous speed at which it has enacted rules on AI. And I will explain what I mean by that. Could we please skip to the timeline slide, please? Thank you. This one, yeah. So in this slide, we wanted to depict the ramping up of AI-related rules in China. In fact, China has about 30 sets of laws, that's 30, laws, regulations, and guidance on AI. And these were formulated as early as 2016. But the key ones to note here would be the last three on the right. So the algorithmic recommendation provisions, which apply to content decision algorithms. The deep synthesis provisions, which apply to deep or machine learning to produce synthetic content, so like deep fakes. As well as the interim, provisional, or administrative measures for generative AI services, which I will refer to as Gen AI measures for short. And we will be deep diving into the Gen AI measures particularly. One thing to note is they are already in effect. So they were passed on the 13th of July this year, and they took effect just 1 month, slightly over 1 month later, on the 15th of August. So they're already in effect. But before we go into the generative AI measures, we wanted to kind of make two very high-level observations about China's general approach to policy and lawmaking with regards to AI. Number one, China's approach appears to be iterative and incremental. It aims to regulate specific types of AI or targeted issues, for example, deep synthesis technologies, algorithmic decision-making and recommendations, and even the use of interim or provisional in its 2023 generative AI measures suggests this. And this is as opposed to an overarching, all-encompassing law right from the outset, like the EU AI Act, for example. And it may be argued that this might be because of China's political system and its model of government and lawmaking, which pretty much allows it to enact and amend laws much quicker than most other jurisdictions. So an iterative model could actually work for it. The second comment is that there seems to be a distinctly strong focus on the political stability of China. There is mention of national security, there's mention of public opinion, there's mention of social mobilization. So clearly these are very important policy considerations for China, and more so than perhaps, say, individual rights and harms. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, China has responded with incredible speed in keeping up with AI developments. So just look at the slide, just look at the number of measures that have been implemented in 2023 alone. I'll zoom in on three of these. Firstly, on the 31st of May, the State Council or the Cabinet announced a plan to submit a draft AI law. This will be submitted to their National People's Congress Standing Committee for review. But unfortunately, this has not been published, right, in any draft form. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know what it contains, nor have there been any definitive dates released as to when it will be actually published or enacted. On the 11th of October, the government laid down a blacklisting procedure for data sources used to train AI models. So under these rules, training data sets must, number one, pass a security assessment. Number two, must not contain more than 5% of illegal and harmful content. So 5% is slightly interesting, slightly arbitrary, some might say. Also, what constitutes illegal and harmful content? Well, this has been defined to include data that advocates terrorism, violence, spreads misinformation, contains any censored information that overthrows the socialist system, damages the country's image, or undermines national unity and social stability. So those policy concerns that I mentioned about earlier. Number three, the training data sets must have consent from individuals if they contain their personal data. And there must be some guideline in place to avoid intellectual property infringements as well. So all of this is highly, highly relevant in a Gen AI setting. Next slide, please. As promised, we will talk a bit more about these seminal measures for generative AI that were passed in July and took effect on 15 August. We wanted to start off with understanding how it actually applies, the scope of its application. So the measures could only apply to generative AI that is provided to the public in China, to the public. So if a company simply develops and then deploys generative AI internally, that is not caught by the measures. However, even if an AI service provider is based outside of China, but makes its service or app available to the public in China, then it is caught by the measures. And any non-compliance could result in the authorities blocking that service altogether and taking other enforcement action against the company. One wonders if, say, there was a technical breach of a particular requirement, whether that could result in the cessation of a business altogether in China. So that could be quite a high bar for certain foreign entities, at least, to meet. The Chinese authorities have the power to classify certain types of generative AI, so they do have that power reserved under these measures. And it's likely to be similar to the EU AI Act's approach with regards to the risk levels, unacceptable, high, limited, minimal, no risk. But at the moment, we haven't seen any classifications released just yet. There is also a bunch of responsibilities that AI service providers need to discharge under these measures. For instance, they need to ensure that their training data sources and basic models are lawful, so they comply with other, applicable laws like privacy, IP, etc. The AI generated content complies with China's censorship laws. So the content that's generated by the system needs to adhere to censorship, regulations. Steps have been taken to prevent the addiction to the generative AI product. So this is a particularly unique and interesting one, but essentially the idea is that there must not be an over-reliance or an over-consumption, especially by underage users to generative AI. And finally, contents generated by generative AI must be labeled or watermarked as being such. So there is accompanying guidance on what that watermark needs to look like, what it needs to include, etc. In addition, right, that's not even the end. In addition to that, we actually might need to do a security assessment and algorithm filing. So one is an assessment and one is a filing with authorities for any services, products, or apps that have public opinion attributes or social mobilization capabilities. Back to the policy, highlights that, we mentioned earlier. This has a very broad definition, right? Public opinion attributes, social mobilization capabilities. It includes blogs, chat rooms, short video platforms, live video streaming, but also any other internet information service that provides channels for the public to express their opinions or the ability for the public to engage in specific activities. So it's pretty much, any kind of channel that allows or empowers or enables that. There is a prescribed checklist for each of the security assessment and algorithm filing required under these measures if these need to be done. Finally, on foreign investment, the measures themselves are silent, right? So they do not restrict foreign ownership or investment into generative AI that is used in China per se. However, if a separate license is required by the business, for example, an internet content provider license, then that license may have conditions around foreign ownership and investment. Next slide, please. We wanted to very quickly highlight that there have been already at least a couple of cases on copyrightability of AI-generated works in China. In this particular decision, Tencent was found to be the lawful copyright owner of an article that it had generated using a generative AI software called Dreamwriter. The article was then republished by Inxun Tech, and this republication was found to have infringed on Tencent's copyright to the article, even though it had used Gen AI as part of that creation of the work. So the courts went into quite a long analysis as to, the litmus test around, how copyright came about and how it vested in Tencent. But I think it's fair to say that the courts in China are certainly receptive to considering legal implications of AI deployment and even adapting these to suit the context and application of existing IP laws. Apologies. Next slide, please. Finally, we come to our final slide for Asia, where we wanted just to highlight the promise of AI in Asia as being one of the fastest growing regions in the world. Yet at the same time, the challenge really for Asia is in coming to an integrated approach for governing and regulating AI, whilst the aspiration is to seek interoperability and consensus rather than a noodle bowl of conflicting policies and frameworks. It will be challenging given the fragmented patchwork of laws that currently exist in this part of the world. And with that, I'll hand it back to David to wrap us up.
Thanks, Charmian. So we thought it would be helpful to close this part of the session before the Q&A with a few takeaways, and they are these. First, although many jurisdictions have yet to bring comprehensive AI legislation into force, it's really important to bear in mind that AI is essentially already regulated in many respects, nevertheless, through other laws that cover everything from human rights and equalities through to data privacy, where in Europe, for example, there are already laws, have been for some time, in relation to automated decision making, but also through contract, IP, competition, antitrust, consumer protection, export control, product safety, negligence, and even the criminal law, of course. So a key point to remember is that just because a particular jurisdiction may not have brought specific AI laws into place, it doesn't mean that there's a free-for-all in relation to the operation of AI businesses and products where the law does not yet reach. Next, in many developed economies, scraping the web for AI training data and also in connection with collecting data for use within an AI tool is quite likely to infringe one or more of intellectual property laws, data privacy laws, contract, and so on. Indeed, relatively recently, 11 different data privacy regulators from various jurisdictions around the world made a joint statement around how scraping the web is likely to infringe just data privacy laws if there's any personal data involved, and could potentially both be an issue for the entity that's scraping, but also for the website operator that permits the scraping, which was really interesting. Next, I think it's also important to realize that where it may be the case that scraping the web for data may be problematic, it doesn't mean that using your own customer or your own corporate or employee data is necessarily without issue as well. It can certainly still raise data privacy issues, IP issues, contract and confidentiality as well if you're using services that do not keep the data that you share on them confidential to you. I think it's probably been pretty clear from this presentation that AI-specific regulation is inevitable with most regimes and is quite likely to have extraterritorial application, because it's very difficult to envisage a regime passing AI laws which would not be triggered if you simply situated your business outside of the jurisdiction and provided AI services into it. And indeed, if you look at the way the EU AI Act is currently drafted, it will have extraterritorial application in relation to anyone deploying AI services into the EU, and I think that model is likely to be followed in many other jurisdictions. Fines also have the potential to be high. If you just take at least the EU AI Act again, what we're seeing there is an intent that fines will be set at even higher than under GDPR, so 6% of global turnover, or 30 million euros, whichever is the higher. So we can imagine that some prime targets may be on the receiving end of some fairly significant fines when the act comes into force. So the conclusion, I think, inevitably is that businesses need an effective AI governance framework, and they need to be putting it in place now. It's critical that companies build a capability to ensure they understand and track how every part of the business, from product and sales to finance and HR, plan to use AI, so that the leadership and legal teams can make sure that the opportunities presented by AI, which are undoubted, are maximized, but while risk and compliance exposure is managed and minimized. The critical challenge, of course, is that in the short term at least, and potentially further into the future, as governments rush to put AI legislation in place, there will be increasing divergence across AI regulatory regimes, presenting a unique challenge for global businesses. We've worked, of course, with many clients to develop AI governance frameworks that reflect current regulatory regimes and anticipate, as far as is possible, forthcoming changes. Certainly be pleased to have a discussion with you about how we can help your business develop a systematic and effective approach to AI governance and enable you to navigate this complex and challenging area, particularly in such a cross-border world. Let's now turn to our Q&A, and we've had a number of really interesting questions, and I'm going to start with this one for any of the panelists, so jump in. We'll start with, is there any hope for a more standardized international approach to regulation? Who would like to take that?
Shall I have an attempt at that, David? I think in the Early stages, no. I think each jurisdiction is in its own way working its way towards a set of regulations that suits its economic and social conditions and legislative capacity. I think Pablo and Genevieve's description of how it's working in the US was very interesting. However, there is clearly in all of the major jurisdictions a desire to try to make things work internationally. And I think as you've seen with accounting standards first, now increasingly with climate reporting standards and so forth, there is a move towards regulation looking more similar. And I think we can expect that to come in time. But certainly for the foreseeable future, I think people who are either users or developers of AI need to be able to cope with quite a wide variety of different regulatory frameworks.
Thank you, Matthew. Does anyone else on the panel want to add anything? Otherwise, we'll move to another question.
I'm happy to just add on. I think Matthew is absolutely right. And, if we were to draw an analogy to say, data privacy legislation, I think what is common would be the fundamental principles. I mean, that there are a lot of commonalities with the principles, but I think when you talk about regulatory frameworks, that's when things get a little bit more complex, because how something is actually translated into the laws and the rules and the requirements will definitely be dependent on a bunch of other, policy considerations and culture and needs.
Thank you, Charmin. Really interesting question here. Do any of the forthcoming AI legislative environments make special provisions to ease or prohibit AI in particular industries? For example, making it easier to have driverless cars or harder to give personal financial advice to the public, or some other industry specific provision? Does anyone want to pick that up on the panel?
Yeah, I really think that question is excellent. I was thinking again, maybe an analogy could be drawn to other regulatory frameworks where there might be sort of a baseline, law. It might, encompass any kind of industry, but then at the same time, concurrently, if there are certain industries where, there are certain unique, situations or use cases where we may need to actually have a bit more of a targeted industry specific or sector specific set of rules. So it might be concurrent, and I think that might be the approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one part of the answer that I can add is that, for example, while it's not necessarily industry specific, if you look at the EU AI Act, it seeks to proscribe certain types of AI systems as presenting unacceptable risk, and there's a list that you can find in the EU AI Act. And so there will definitively be some industries that might have been more likely to use such systems than others. And it also, next tier down, as Christina mentioned, creates the concept of high-risk systems. And again, they're not particularly industry specific, but for instance, you will see that systems that are used in the context of, let's say, essential public services or immigration or in policing may well be high risk, as well as many others that private companies may wish to use. And so it's definitely worth consulting that the EU AI Act and its definitions, which are pretty extensive around what constitutes a high risk system, because I think one of the issues for companies that are operating in Europe or into Europe will be that there are potential systems that they might want to be using, for instance, in connection with HR, which may well constitute high risk systems. And there is a lot of regulation around high risk systems, which will affect product design, not just sort of policy notices and the like. And so you certainly may well want to use a system that would be categorized as high risk, but you wouldn't want to be using it inadvertently because there are a lot of hoops to jump through before you can do so compliantly. Does anyone want to add anything else on that question, or should we move to another one?
Yeah, David, just very quickly from the U.S. perspective, the approach that's the basis of the question reflects the opposite view, if you will, of the view that I talked about. that's gaining some prominence about, for example, a new independent regulatory authority that can do audits, require public disclosures, and can implement and oversee or enforce a licensing system. This notion of a risk-based, industry-specific, measure twice before cutting once perspective is essentially on the other side of that. And there was a report that's gaining a decent amount of attention on the Hill from Stanford University's Reg Lab for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence that really takes that opposite view and really calls on, in particular, Congress to get quality information about risks and the performance of AI in specific use cases in specific industry sectors before pursuing this more, if you will, omnibus approach. So in the US, this is precisely where the debate seems to be.
Thank you, Pablo. While we've got you, be great to get your thoughts on the extent to which US regulation is likely to apply extraterritorially.
It's a great question. Whether or not we will see U.S. regulations apply extraterritorially, we really don't see any substantive indicia of that. But it is quite, of course, as you and our other colleagues have noted, other jurisdictions are already providing for extraterritorial application. So it's it could be something that we see going forward in the U.S. I will say that in other related and unrelated areas of policy and law, be it U.S. export controls, antitrust, anti-corruption, of course, we do see the application of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Now, that having been said, the U.S., before it does that, particularly in keeping with the leadership position in the industry that I think it would like to assert for itself, is going to need to balance its desires to regulate extraterritorially with the risk of stifling innovation, particularly from an international perspective. A good example of that is the deliberation that Department of Commerce is taking to calls by the Republican Congress, for example, to restrict access by China using export control laws to the open source RISC-V architecture. Once again, there could be major international innovation issues associated with that. My final observation is that, once again, on this question, in keeping with the leadership role that the U.S. wants to assert for itself, query whether or not its interest in collaborating with other nations, international bodies, could be viewed by the U.S. as a more feasible approach to creating or contributing to a cohesive global framework for AI regulation than merely the extraterritorial application of domestic law. We'll have to see what the answer to that is in the future.
Can I just add to that, David, that I think an element of extraterritoriality is almost inevitable in AI regulation because of the nature of AI. And I think the problem is almost an inverted one, where it will be those jurisdictions which have a high level of AI development and innovation activity and a less developed regulatory framework, which will be the ones which pose a challenge to the strongly regulated jurisdictions. So, for example, at the moment, the EU looks set to be, Christina gave the timetable, a strongly regulated jurisdiction. The main innovation, commercial innovation in AI is happening in the US. What will be the effect of EU regulation, which will be extraterritorial in its application, on innovation in the US? I think that's a really fascinating question, which we certainly don't have time to get into now.
That's a perfectly timely observation. Thank you, Matthew. So to sum up, we expect growing divergence across AI regulatory regimes for the moment at least, and most likely into the future. And as a firm, we continue to track global developments, and we'll be providing other update sessions like this one. So if you'd like to sign up to our email list so we can help you keep ahead, please fill in your details on the feedback form that will appear on your screens in a few moments. So there's a specific question asking if you would like to be put on the list, so let us know. So in the meantime, thanks again to our panelists, everyone else at the firm who's helped us deliver this presentation today, Nikki and Paul, that's you, and to every one of our guests who've joined the webinar. I hope you found it helpful. We're looking forward to keeping in touch. And with that, I'll say thank you very much and goodbye for the moment.